Pan-Pacific Championships. Okay, so that's just a swimming event with all the countries of the Asia Pacific. Pacific Games is, we all know the Olympics, we all know the Commonwealth Games, and then all around the world, each of the different continental associations of the Olympic movement have a game. So you have what's called the Asian Games, the All Africa Games, the Pan American Games, and down here in our part of the world, we have what's called the Pacific Games, which is what I look after. The reason you probably haven't heard of it is up until now, it has not included Australia and New Zealand. It's been an event mainly for the island countries, so Papua New Guinea, Fiji, Samoa, Tonga, and a whole bunch of other ones. But starting this year, I'll talk a little bit about it, Australia and New Zealand are coming to our games for the first time because we're using some of our sports to qualify athletes for Rio Olympics next year. So that's a little bit about the Pacific Games. I'm also part of the Gold Coast 2018 Commonwealth Games on the Sport Technical Committee. So GOLDOC, as it's called, I'm sure some of you have heard of GOLDOC. It's the organising committee for the Games in 2018. They have a board of directors, and underneath the board there's a number of committees. One of them is the Sport Committee, which I'm a part of, and then they've got a Risk and Finance Committee and also a Marketing. So I have a bit of Games experience. My first Games was the Sydney Olympics in 2000, and then I did 4 years on Commonwealth Games in Melbourne, and then I moved across and started doing Pacific Games. And I think we're lucky in Australia that the Commonwealth Games are coming back so soon after 2006, and for some of you guys, you might find yourself involved in it in 3 years' time. As a paid staff, volunteer, athlete. Do we have any budding athletes here? No.
We have a few.
See who said that. So just a little bit about the Pacific Games. You can see on the screen there, Papua New Guinea is hosting this year's event. It's actually the 15th edition of the Games. They started back in the 1960s. At that time, the Pacific countries didn't have access to the Olympic Games or the Commonwealth Games. They were small island countries, not a lot of money, not a lot of development in sport, and these games were put together to give them some sort of international competition. Over the last 50 years, as we've all developed our international programs, most of the Pacific countries now are full members of the IOC, so they compete at the Olympics, they compete at the Commonwealths, and the Pacific Games as well. So we've got 22 island countries, 28 sports on our program this year, so it's actually quite a big event. We've got probably around 3,000 athletes coming. Commonwealth Games is 4,000 athletes, Olympic Games is 10,500 athletes. So our event is smaller than that, but it's still quite a big event to manage. 3,000 athletes, probably 1,000 team officials. We'll have an athletes village in Papua New Guinea of around 4,000. We won't have everybody there at the same time, of course. Some athletes compete in the first week and go home. But it's still quite a major undertaking. And as I've noted there, there's an invitation to Australia and New Zealand to compete in 4 sports at this year's Games, 4 out of the 28, which is weightlifting, rugby sevens, taekwondo and sailing. And they're sports that our movement has thought, well, if we bring Australia and New Zealand in, they won't devastate the island countries in terms of their a gap in standards. Weightlifting, actually, Australia and New Zealand are behind countries like PNG, Samoa. Rugby sevens, Fiji are just the world champions last weekend. They won the IRB 7 series. The last leg was in London. Fiji came in at number 1. So they're pretty strong. Taekwondo, Australia and New Zealand probably a little bit ahead, but not too far. And the same with sailing. So if it goes well this year, we'll look at branching it out into future games, bringing Australia and New Zealand in more sports. Because what we're all trying to do, whether you're working on the Olympics, the Commonwealth Games or these games, is to add value to the athlete experience. Some of you might have heard about the IOC's Vision 2020, which came out, I think, late last year. It's an initiative of the new IOC president, Thomas Bach from Germany, looking at ways in which the Games program at the Olympic level, the highest standard of competition in the world, can actually do a better job for its athletes, attracting more young people, and really regenerating some of the sports program. We have the same challenge. We've got to make sure that our games in the Pacific, or Commonwealth Games here, presents the best possible platform for the athletes. If it's not a qualifier for something, if you don't get rankings points by achieving there, a lot of the athletes will say, yeah, but why am I going? What's the point? I could go to World Titles later in the year. In athletics, we've got World Championships in Beijing in August. Swimming in Kazan, Russia, I think it is, coming up soon. Athletes are asking questions, even at the Olympic level. You know, what is the benefit? You might think, well, the Olympics, gee, you know, it's the Olympic gold medal. But if you're talking about tennis, golf, basketball, you know, the top athletes in those sports do think about whether the Olympics is actually part of their pathway. So that's a little bit about Pacific Games. What we're actually doing this year in Port Moresby is a huge construction program, a little bit like what you see here on the Gold Coast, where you're building the Games Village here at Parklands. Well, at the University of Papua New Guinea, which is a campus similar to this, they're putting 10 new huge accommodation towers in. They're going to be finished at the end of this month. They're about 10 days away from completion, and that's where all the athletes will be housed. And then afterwards, the kids who come to study and have nowhere to stay at the moment in Port Moresby are going to have 10 new accommodation buildings. And when we talk about legacy of the Games, whether you're at Olympic, Commonwealth or Pacific, where you accommodate the Games athletes and officials is often one of the key legacies of a game. So in Sydney, the Olympics in 2000, all of the athletes are in what's now a new suburb called Newington, right near the Homebush Bay complex. In Melbourne, Parkville I think it's called, right near Melbourne University. And then you'll have here, where you've got a new accommodation facility right near Griffith, right near the hospital and the Health and Knowledge Precinct that the state government is building. So at any Games, what you do around the Athletes Village, you're providing a solution for students, or you're providing housing accommodation for the general public somewhere in the city area. So it's quite an exciting concept, and what we're doing this year in PNG is a real legacy for the young people who study. And up there, they've got ambitions to maybe follow Gold Coast and have a Commonwealth Games one day. There's plenty of money up in PNG, believe it or not. They're very rich in resources, mining, oil, gas, gold. And I think the Commonwealth Games, well, we know it's heading to Africa. After 2018, there's only one bid for 2022. It's Durban, South Africa. And I think the Commonwealth movement are very keen to get their games out around the world as much as they can, not just the traditional hosts like Australia and England, Scotland, Canada. They'll be going to South Africa in 2022. They were in Delhi, India in 2010. And a country like PNG, I think, has realistic ambitions to one day host the Commonwealth Games. As I said, the Commonwealth Games is around 4,000 athletes, 1,500 officials, roughly 6,000 people. They're doing 4,000 in Port Moresby, 28 sports. Commonwealth Games, 6,000 people, 17 sports. So you get a sense of the scale, they're not too far apart. And that's just a little, this is a master plan exercise. I don't have the current photos, but their village is very close to being completed. You can see there's an academic corridor where all the faculty buildings are, like here. Then you've got the accommodation corridor where the towns are being built. And then you've got the sporting corridor. There's lots of space up there, so there's playing fields and sports facilities attached to that precinct, like you'll have here at Griffith with your athletics track and some of the other facilities that will be located around the Games Village for the Commonwealth Games. A little bit of interesting sort of analysis. How do these games get funded? Papua New Guinea, for the Pacific, is quite a unique situation. They're actually self-funding the games. So believe it or not, most Pacific Games host countries, so if the games are in Fiji or Samoa, coming up in Tonga in 4 years' time, they don't have the money to build swimming pools, athletes' villages, athletics tracks, indoor sports halls. So they look for governments through aid programs that will help them get the money to build those sort of facilities. And in the Pacific, China is a major benefactor. So we're moving away sort of from sport and more into international relations here, but China, a big part of their international diplomacy is sport. They actually will give countries an athletics track or a swimming pool or an indoor sports hall as part of their diplomatic relationship with the country. Australia and New Zealand would never do that. Our aid program in the Pacific will build hospitals, schools, roads, things that we kind of think that these countries need more than anything else. But China take the view, what do you want? We want a stadium? You want a pool? We'll do that for you. And China has very different imperatives. They're a country that's concerned about their diplomatic relationships and networks around the world. They have Taiwan. Some countries recognise Taiwan, not China. And they want to make sure the countries that recognise them stay recognising them. So that's just deviating a little bit. But we do have an issue with our games in the sense of where the money's going to come from to build these facilities. And the way China does it is they'll build the venues, usually through soft loans. So it won't be free of charge, but it'll be basically interest-free loans that they'll deliver to those countries. And I say mixed capital legacies because if you can imagine if the Chinese government goes into somewhere and builds a venue, is it necessarily going to be the venue that that country needs and is sustainable for the long term? Might be good for hosting a games in 2 years' time, but what about maintaining it over 30 or 40 years? Who's going to pay for that? The Chinese don't. They build it and walk away, and they build what they want to build because they know how to build them. Whereas, so these countries can often get stuck with buildings that aren't quite what they need for the long term, but they were desperate to get the building in place so they could stage the games. And that's why when we've got games like Commonwealth here, where the state government of Queensland takes the financial risk and responsibility for building the venues, and hopefully they'll build what's actually needed for the people of the Gold Coast and South East Queensland going forward, and is sustainable. So these are some of the legacy issues that we face in our own games. They're real live issues. Money is involved, and long-term planning is involved. And just as an example, this year in PNG, they last had the Pacific Games in 1991, so it's only 24 years ago. And there's not one single venue that was fit for purpose in 2015 from 24 years ago. Everything else was decayed, demolished, basically not able to be used again because those venues hadn't been maintained, and their construction program has basically been to start from scratch, which we would be horrified if we did that in Australia. You know, if the Gold Coast had the Commonwealth Games in 20 years from now, up to 2018, you would hope that 80% of the venues would be fine to be used again. It would be a disaster if you had to start from the beginning. But that's often what countries, not just in the Pacific, but in other parts of the world face. How do you actually maintain facilities? Before I get to the Gold Coast, with PNG, so the government's putting in, I think I said on a previous slide, 1.5 billion kina. In our money, that's about 750 million Australian dollars. That is a lot of money. The Commonwealth Games here will cost a bit more than that, but not much more. Commonwealth Games in Melbourne, 2006, 1.1 billion Australian dollars. So the size of this Games, it's a lot of money. And I was talking to Hallie earlier, the government said, yeah, we'll pay that, no problem. We'll build it, we'll build all the venues. But up until recently, nobody had been thinking, okay, what happens afterwards? And fortunately, the Games Organising Committee up in PNG have got some smart people there who are not just thinking for how they're going to deliver the Games this year, but what happens afterwards. and they've been able to bring in some people, some expert people from Australia actually, who are up there now and doing some real planning in terms of how these venues will get managed after July this year when the games are held. And I think that's the only way that we can guarantee some sort of ability for Papua New Guinea to be able to maintain the venue